Earlier this week, one of our students inside of our Hard Surface Academy asked us a very important question, basically one that has to do with the foundations of modeling before you begin modeling in the first place, and we're going to discuss that in today's video. Now, if you're brand new to Hard Surface Modeling, we do have a free course linked in the description over on blenderbros.com. Hard Surface Modeling Jumpstart. If you're not used to Blender and don't know how to model in Blender, that course will get you up to speed very quickly. Let's get started with the video. So what I'm going to do here is use a very basic example. I'm going to use the same example I used during that call just to demonstrate. So I'm going to just trace out something basic, maybe like some sort of handheld device. So maybe we'll do a solidification, we'll do something like this. So what a lot of people struggle with is, like I said, not the modeling portion, but understanding the size, the detail placement, the proportions, all these things that must be considered before you even start modeling anything significant. Now, let me demonstrate what I mean, because a lot of people just start modeling, putting things together, slapping details everywhere, and they call it a model. It's not a model, it's a shitty model. So I guess technically it is a model, but it's not a good one. That's the issue. So what you need to consider before you start modeling anything is the foundation. How does this thing look? How are the proportions? How is the size? All these things. So for example, make sure you turn on cavity here, by the way, for that nice edge highlight. So for example, if this was meant to be a handheld device, I wouldn't really just start modeling after tracing it out. What I want to do is I want to figure out what size feels right, what size feels better. This is where reference photos can really come in handy if you aren't too sure. So for example here, this doesn't look like anything significant, but if I increase the solidification here and make it thicker, okay, this is starting to look like some sort of handheld device that I could actually use, right? Now, you don't want to go too high, you don't want to go too low. You want to find that nice middle ground, that nice balance where you can actually see this thing as being a feasible type of product or whatever it might be. It needs to feel like it's the right size, you know what I mean? And it's a very intuitive feeling, but especially if you're using references, it shouldn't be something very difficult. So for example, if I kind of play with this thickness, I think maybe something right around here would actually be, a decent size, right? Now, there's another thing you need to consider before you start modeling and slapping the details everywhere. And to a certain extent, that's going to be functionality, right? For example, how hard is this going to be to grip? I probably couldn't grip this, but I probably couldn't really grip this either, right? I need to find that nice middle balance of thickness and kind of what seems a bit more realistic. And again, reference photos will help a lot with that. Now, another thing a lot of people don't mention, including myself, I should probably mention this more in tutorials, is understanding the effects that bevels will have, because we use bevels a lot during hard surface modeling. So for example, this might look, like a relatively thick object, but if I were to go in here real quick and I were to actually bevel both sides here, let me quickly dissolve out that random weird geometry, but if I were to go in here and bevel this, it's gonna look a lot thinner, right? Just by adding that bevel, it looks way thinner than it did without the bevel. You see what I mean? So you want to keep this in mind in the back of your head. When you're modeling, you need to consider the effect that the actual bevel is going to have on the object and how it looks, right? So if I were to add a bevel like that, I'd probably want a little bit more thickness to compensate for the bevel making it seem thinner, if that makes sense. So what I'm going to do here real quick, let me just undo all this I did before. So something like this would probably be a good start. And then what I could do is I could apply the solidify right here. There we go. And I'm just going to dissolve these two out so I don't have that issue. So maybe I'll go up here and I'll introduce a bevel to that. And then we'll go to these sides like we did before. And then I can introduce a bevel to this as well. I'll press the C key to clamp it and then just merge everything, that overlapping edge there in the middle, to get rid of that. And now you're going to see, just by making it a little bit thicker, now it kind of has a much better proportion, right? A much better grip here, because the bevel kind of curves inwards and makes it look a little bit thinner than it might otherwise be. And these are the things you can't really teach in modeling. These are the things you have to feel out, you have to understand before you start the modeling process. And a lot of people just start slapping details. Like, what the hell are you doing, bro? You need to like think before you start doing these types of things. I understand it's fun to learn how to model. It's fun to make some basic stuff, right? And my tutorials from 3 years ago, aren't perfect. I've progressed a lot since then. But if you've seen my more recent tutorials in the past year, I focus a heck of a lot more on these fundamentals because they're so important. And it's something that, we learn over time, we get better at over time. So I'm gonna go in here, I'm gonna bevel this area just to kind of like echo this shape, right? And you're gonna see now it almost looks a little bit thinner just by adding in that bevel right there. The whole device kind of looks thinner, right? And we could go here to the back as well, and we could introduce a bevel. Now we don't wanna go all the way. I mean, I suppose we could, but again, when you introduce bevels like this, the whole device is gonna probably look a little bit smaller than it otherwise would. So you need to consider these things in the back of your head. So maybe here I could go a little bit smaller on that bevel. And you have to kind of figure, like, would this thing be comfortable to hold? Maybe, maybe not. That's where, again, reference photos would be very useful. So, something like that. Or if I wanted to, I could just go, full bevel there as well. That could even work. So that's the first step. Before we start doing any significant modeling, we need to get in here, figure out our proportions, figure out the basic block out, and make sure that foundation is established before we do any additional work. If you start modeling on a weak foundation, no matter how good you are at detailing, the entire model is going to look like shit. It just is. And a lot of people, they don't have the correct foundation before they start modeling, and that's why, their designs are just average. Everyone's a competitor to them basically because they all look the same. So here, this is, decent. Again, I'm not using a reference photo for this tutorial, but perhaps this would be better. Maybe I could look up like, some sort of similar handheld device to kind of get a better reference, right? But for this tutorial, I can kind of feel it out more or less. Now let's do a little bit more to this one. Maybe I wanted to add in some sort of trigger down here to the bottom, right? So I could go in, let me actually move this to the center, and then maybe I could go in here. And this is the same idea. Instead of just making, a random detail like that, and then, oh, there's the trigger, right? A lot of people do this. They just spend 2 seconds just putting in a detail like this, which looks like shit. You want to consider, how can you make this feel more dynamic, more visually appealing, more functional even? And all you really have to do to accomplish these tasks is just slightly rotate, slightly scale. Make these very small micro adjustments, and it's going to look a heck of a lot better in just a few seconds of your time. So really consider, what you're doing. Do you want something like this? Or do you want something like that? Like, what looks better to you, Perhaps instead of making this perfectly parallel, we have a little bit of an angle there. So now there's a bit more attention brought to it. And then what I could do is maybe, bring some more interest to that by adding in a chamfer, and then maybe some bevels on top of that, right? And already we have a much more interesting looking, type of device here. And this is where you can really start getting into some of the more advanced techniques. For example, a lot of people, especially that are beginners, would stop here. They just say, there's the trigger, there we go, we're good. Not really, because are you really going to see a trigger that looks like this in real life or in a video game or anything? No, you're going to have a nice natural fusion, a nice bevel between the two objects. And a lot of people skip over these important fundamentals that really establish the foundation of the entire design. So, what you're gonna have to do here is mimic that reality, right? Introduce the bevel between the two objects. So if you haven't seen my video where I discuss the how you should actually bevel with the discontinuous and continuous edges, I'll have the thing on the screen right now so you can use it for reference. What we're gonna wanna do in order to actually fuse these together, we're probably gonna wanna introduce a bevel here as well. So that way we have a nice continuous edge flowing, and then that way I'll be able to bevel it much easier. So we'll get in here, can put a bevel right there, and again, just make sure it looks like it's the right size. So you can kind of play with the size of the bevel. And you can go large, you can go smaller. Perhaps smaller might be a better idea. Or if you wanted to, you could even go with a chamfer and then put a bevel on that. So for example, I could go here. And I made a video on this recently as well, but I think just a regular bevel is going to look a lot better in this particular situation. We'll just put it the other side. And now all we need to do is basically fuse this to the object with a union boolean, right? And you're going to see we have some nasty shading errors here, but no problem. We can mitigate that by just introducing a bit more density here, and that'll go away. And then effectively, all I need to do is apply this boolean, and I need to make sure this is nicely fused to the object, because right now this looks incredibly fake, awful. And a lot of people, if you go to any like newbie's portfolio, like you're going to see this, right? This is a very, very common mistake. People don't put that extra 10% to make the model look 200% better. You know what I mean? It's that 80-20 rule. It's those very, very small micro adjustments that you think are useless, but that really give you, 10, 20, 30 times the actual results. And that's how you're going to really jump ahead of most people who have no clue what they're doing, right? So we can go in here, and I'm going to have to use an offset cut for this one. Otherwise, it's going to be a mess. This is where, a CAD software would probably perform this better, but I don't really care that much. It's very easy to do with a simple add-on like Mesh Machine. Just round this out a bit more, just like that. And now we're just going to have a much more natural fusion to the object. You see that? You see how much better this looks? Here's the before, and here's the after. This is the stuff that you need to consider before you start doing the more intense modeling stuff like detailing, right? Do the small stuff like this. It's going to look a heck of a lot better. And if you wanted to take this a step further, there are going to be some minor shading errors simply because, that's the nature of polygon software and n-gons on curved surfaces. You could use a Boolean cleanup to, clean this up a bit, and it's mostly going to go away. Another thing you could use is something like quad remesher, where basically we can just remesh the entire object, right? And now we're going to have actual, clean geometry here. If you wanted like a much more natural fusion, but honestly, when we're doing hard surface modeling, you don't really need to remesh it unless there's a particular reason you would need to do that. So there you go. And once you have the foundation set up, this is where you can really start getting in and adding your details, focusing on those visual design elements, the 70-30 rule, echoing, detail clustering. And once you have the foundation established, it's going to be a lot easier to use these principles. It's going to be a lot more intuitive. So, for example, here, a lot of focus is probably going to be brought to the front, for example. So I could go in and, start designing the front, introduce some bevels here, some, slice operations, and really start bringing focus to the areas of the model that are going to be the most important for you, right? So I could go in here, maybe make a nice chamfer on that area, a chamfer on this area, a small one, and you can just keep, kind of working on this and stacking the detail and just making this look a heck of a lot better now that you've established the proper foundation. So the main point of this tutorial is to show you, before you start modeling, you need to get the foundation set up. I know I probably said this a million times in this tutorial, but if you want to see some actual results and you want to stop struggling with this stuff, it's going to be a much, much better option to get the foundation set first, and then you can start the modeling process, and it's going to be 10 times easier, I promise. Now again, if you are brand new to hard surface modeling, I'd really recommend heading over to blunderbros.com, pick up our free Jumpstart course. It'll show you all the tools we use, the modeling techniques, rendering, composition, design principles, all the stuff kind of condensed into one free course, which is, you can watch right now. I highly recommend it. We put a lot of effort into that course. It has over 55,000 students right now, so you're going to get a lot of value from it, and I'll link that in the description. And once you have those modeling tools set up, then you can start taking it a step further, getting cool designs, following all these different rules, and really you'll have the foundation you need to have much better and much cleaner 3D models.